Patrick was one of those guys that if anyone could find his way home, it was him. But then more time passed by and she decided to call her son back again. This time, they started the arduous task of looking for him in and around town and even on the water. Sometime later, they would actually contact the authorities of Manatee County Sheriff's Department to aid in his search. A couple days after that, they would involve the Coast Guard. 2 days later, they would find Patrick's boat located miles off the coast in a shipping lane. It was out past Tampa Bay and in the Gulf of Mexico, which was highly unusual for such a shallow boat that was not suitable for that. But the thing is, Patrick wasn't on the boat. A lot of his belongings were, including a straw hat. The only thing that seemed to be missing was the anchor for the boat. It was highly unusual for the boat to be so far out from the bay. And the authorities collected the boat and did a full investigation on everything that was on it. The boat's gas tank was bone dry, indicating that the boat was left on to run until it completely ran out of gas. After doing a full investigation of the boat, the police found no indication of a crime being committed, so they released the boat back to the family. Now, Patrick's son actually found some markings on the side of the boat that weren't there. It was red paint that had been run across the side. Coast Guard used a method called reverse drift. And this method is to indicate the trajectory of the boat to see where it actually came from. And they determined that the boat had come from somewhere near Manatee River in the Tampa Bay. This is where they assumed that the boat had already come from, so it didn't tell them anything new, but it also didn't explain why the boat was so far out there. The boat was found, but Patrick was not. Patrick found almost 9 days after he had gone missing. Patrick was found floating face down in the water, and he was tied with rope wrapped around his waist and then wrapped vertically around his crotch and his shoulders several times, leaving his arms free, with a knot in the front and the other end of the rope tied to the missing boat anchor. Patrick's body was fairly clean and he was fully clothed except for a missing shoe. Even his wallet was left in his back pocket. Unfortunately, he had suffered from a gunshot wound to the face and the side of the head. The place where they found his body was actually only in 4 to 6 feet of water, located in the Tampa Bay, miles and very far away from where his boat was located. An autopsy was conducted and the medical examiner indicated that the gunshot wound was buckshot from a shotgun. The examiner also indicated that the cause of death was undetermined, but he leaned heavily towards the fact that Patrick had taken his own life because of the fact that his arms were free from the binding ropes. Had there been foul play, his arms would have been bound also. With such mysterious circumstances, 2 different theories came about. The police theory that he took his own life would indicate that he had wrapped these ropes around his body and tied the knot, and then sat on the edge of the rocking boat with the engine most likely running. He would then take the anchor and probably place it on his lap, and then take the long nose of the shotgun pointed at himself. This would seem excessive enough on its own, except for the biggest problem. Forensics did a clear search on the boat and found no trace of blood anywhere, which would have been very hard to do with a shotgun. The shotgun was also never found, so the shotgun, his body, and the anchor would have had to all fall in the water at the same time, all while the boat was running. The second theory was foul play, and Patrick's son pointed out that the knots used to tie around his body were not knots that Patrick would have used, nor any experienced boatman would have used such knots. What about no blood spatter on the boat? Or the red paint markings on the side of the boat? Also was the fact that everyone said Patrick was a very happy man that wouldn't have done this, and he also did not like guns and did not own any. This would seem excessive enough on its own, except for the biggest problem. Forensics did a clear search on the boat and found no trace of blood anywhere, which would have been very hard to do with a shotgun. It is assumed that Patrick was in the water for 9 to 10 days, and his body and arms had no sign of scavenger marks. And with a shotgun wounds, Scavengers most likely would have been attracted to the body, such as sharks, alligators, fish, and crustaceans. The medical examiner also confirmed that it was not a contact wound. A contact wound is what happens when the barrel of the gun is pressed up to the skin before being fired. The police conducted a forensic investigation into Patrick's financials, and when someone takes their own life, typically one of the most common reasons is for money troubles, and Patrick didn't have any of those. They also found no evidence that he had withdrawn any type of money to purchase the gun, and none of the local shops had any record that they had sold him the gun. With all the dead ends, Patrick's son was doing his own investigation, and in order to get out where the boat was found, you had to cross underneath a bridge. This bridge had cameras which would have taken a photograph of any passing boats. Finally, the family might have some type of answers, but the police found that when they looked at the file, it was corrupted and they could not pull any type of evidence from it, which led to another dead end. Finally, we come to family friend named Damon. Damon had come to know the family through Patrick's brother, and Patrick certainly knew Damon, but they were not that close. And Damon had displayed very odd behavior surrounding the death of Patrick. He had been seen by the family sobbing uncontrollably and would call the wife of Patrick and talk about crying on the edge of the bay for hours about Patrick's death. This seemed very odd because Damon didn't know Patrick that well, and to act in such an intense manner just seemed out of the ordinary. On one day after Patrick's death, family and close friends had a gathering, and a very odd thing happened. Damon brought his dog, and he tied his dog to the end of a rope, and he tied the rope around his waist, and it was said that he used a very similar, if not the same knot that had been seen on Patrick's body. Also, it is said that Damon would have a mental breakdown every single January, which is the time that Patrick had passed away. Patrick's son alerted police that Damon owned a boat that had red stripes on the side, the same color that had been rubbed against the side of Patrick's boat when they found it. Police didn't have much evidence, so they couldn't force Damon to give them a sample of the red paint, so they had to request it from him. Damon, of course, completely denied the request and would not give it to them, even though he indicated that he was very, very distraught over Patrick's death. Now, eventually, about 5.5 years after Patrick's death, Damon would pass away, and Damon's daughter would actually grant the request to test the red paint. After testing, police found that the red paint was actually a match to the rubbed off red paint on the side of Patrick's boat, but would also call the evidence inconclusive because of the fact that the red paint was so common for that era. This case remains unsolved, so what do you think happened? Did Damon see something that he shouldn't have seen? Because there are in fact rumors of lots of drug running in the area, as well as illegal fish harvesting. It remains a mystery. That's going to do it for today, guys, and I will see you on the other side. In April of 1991, in a small town of Clinton, Missouri, lived a woman named Angela Hammond. She was hanging out with her boyfriend at a neighborhood barbecue. After the barbecue, they decided they were going to hang out and go downtown. But Rob had to head home for a couple of hours to babysit his little brother. Angela decided to go on without him, so Rob went home while Angela stayed out, and they promised they would get back together soon. Within about an hour, as promised, Angela called Rob on a payphone downtown. Rob wasn't done babysitting his little brother, so he had to stay in a couple more hours, so they just started to talk on the phone. Suddenly, Angela's voice grew a little bit distant and nervous as she said that a truck was repeatedly circling the block around the payphone, and she had seen it a couple of times and was concerned when suddenly the truck stopped in front of the payphone and a man got out. He started to walk up to Angela at the payphone, and Rob was on the phone listening to this the whole time. Luckily, he went into the payphone beside her, and the person that the man was trying to call must have not picked up because he wasn't on the phone for merely a second. He left the payphone and went back to his truck and got in it. And it seemed like he was rifling around through a couple of things. He got a flashlight out and he was looking for something. And the whole while, Rob is on the phone listening to Angela describe this. They quickly forget about it and start talking about some other things. Because of the short duration of the call, Angela thought that maybe the phone wasn't working, so she called out to the man and asked him if he needed to use her phone, and he said no, that he would try back in a couple of minutes. The brief interaction with the man must have calmed Angela's nerves down, and suddenly Rob heard Angela let out a piercing scream, and he instinctively bolted for the door and just left the phone on the hook. As he approaches the scene, he sees the same truck that Angela described go speeding past him in the opposite direction, and he hears someone yell out his name from the truck, and by the voice he could tell that it was his fiancée Angela. So Robbie jams the brakes and throws it into reverse, whipping the car around to chase right back after them. He only gets a couple of blocks until he realizes that when he threw it into reverse without fully stopping, he had damaged the transmission, and the car begins to sputter, and slowly the distance starts to increase in between them. The last thing that he ever sees is the dust coming off of the truck's tires and the red brake lights fading into the distance as the truck takes a right and is gone. According to Marcia Cook, who is Angela's mother, she said that Robbie never stopped blaming himself because he promised that he would always take care of her when they got engaged, and he gave her a diamond ring. According to Robbie, he says he often thinks of that moment and it is very torturous for him. He often wonders what happened to her and if she's still alive, and so much wondering and questions gone unanswered. So during their conversation while they were on the phone, Angela had described the man and the truck. She described the man as looking very dirty with a very big beard. And the truck was a 1970s two-tone Ford pickup of a green color. And distinctly, there was a giant fish decal across the entire rear window. The police took the situation very seriously, and they even recruited the state troopers in a giant manhunt. However, nothing turned up, no evidence, and the entire case was based on the testimony of the boyfriend. When they didn't get any evidence, he quickly became a suspect. In about a week, he was cleared. This case remains unsolved to this day. However, it is similar to two other cases of abduction that remain unsolved themselves, of Trudy Darby and Cheryl Kenny. Both of these cases happened within 100 miles of Clinton, Missouri, so they were very close. And both of these women separately, in separate incidents, both worked at convenience stores and were abducted late at night. Even though the case remains unsolved, on the 30th anniversary of the case, new evidence came to light, and police are working on a theory that Angela was mistaken for a different Angela. And this Angela's dad was the lead informant in a narcotics case, and he received a note threatening his daughter Angela on the same day of the abduction. Police believe that because these women had similar names and similar appearances, that it was a case of mistaken identity, but this theory is still being investigated. In 1823, on a small coastal town in Spain, there lived a 16-year-old boy named Alejandro. Alejandro spent his entire life dreaming of being a sailor just like his father. Alejandro's town was known particularly for their whaling, where they would hunt whale for their blubber. Now, Alejandro's father was a bit of a legend who had died in battle hunting a famous whale in a famous whale pod. As the legend goes, his father had hooked the largest bull whale in the entire pod, the most dangerous bull whale. And that whale actually ended up killing his father. This whale had actually killed so many men that he would become famous and a legend himself, known as Toro Monstruo, or monster bull whale. As the tale is told for Alejandro's father, he would hook Toro Monstruo with the harpoon, but the rope wrapped around the cleats would be ripped out of the boat because Toro was so strong, and as the whale dove, that rope wrapped around the leg of his father and pulled his father down into the sea, never to be seen again. But the legend goes that every once in a while, on the horizon, Toro Monstruo can be seen, and he is recognized by the broken stick of the harpoon that is seen jutting out of the water as he comes up for air before diving back down into the water. As the years went on after his father's death, everywhere that Alejandro went, people would bring up his father and tell him just how great his father was for that legendary battle. But they would also mention just how much greater Toro Monstruo was and how he was considered the unkillable whale. Alejandro appreciated all the compliments that he got about his father, but he was particularly upset when they would mention this unkillable whale. And he vowed one day that when he grew up, he would kill that whale and get his revenge on Toro Monstruo. His plan to accomplish that revenge was to seek out the most famous and most successful whaling seaboat captain in the entire town, and that was Captain Narvaez. When Alejandro turned 16, which is the minimum age to become a seaboat first mate, he would begin on that quest. So every day he would go out of his house and walk down the dirt path in his village down towards the town by the coast. Eventually, when he got to the town, he would feel the cobblestone roads underneath his feet and walk past the blacksmith that's pumping the furnace with the shiny metal objects that he had for sale displayed out front. And he would walk past the fish market around the corner back in towards the docks, which were located behind the fish market. He knew that he was close to the docks where all the ships were because he could smell the smell of salt water as well as the soggy wood smell as the wood absorbs all the water. And he would pace back and forth on the docks or just sit there and watch as he would wait for Captain Narvaez to come back from one of their voyages. When the sun would set and it starts to become very dark on the docks, he would head around the corner to a tavern or a bar where people were drinking. This is a sailor's bar where all the sailors hang out. And he would try to talk to as many sailors and whalers as possible. He wanted to learn as much about sailing and whaling as he possibly could because he wanted to become the first mate and become very good at his job and to take down this legendary whale. Determined, every day Alejandro would be at those docks and in that tavern. Eventually, after about 3 months, Captain Narvaez would come back from his journey and Alejandro would find him at that tavern. Captain Narvaez would be seated in the corner of the tavern surrounded by all of his top sailors. And these were a rough bunch of men. They were true sailors. They had the leathery, dark skin from baking in the sun so long. Very aggressive and very loud, shouting obscenities at the bar maidens or drinking heavily when they were on land. Alejandro would sit there at the tavern and just watch Captain Narvaez and his men for a few moments. Eventually, he built up his courage and approached Captain Narvaez. And in front of all of his men, he would tell him who he was, who his father was, and the tale of the whale, and how he vowed for his revenge and would be the one to kill Toro Monstruo. Captain Narvaez patiently listened, just watching him sideways as Alejandro told his tale. And when he was finished, Navarro balked. He said, "Your father was a fine sailor, but Toro Monstruo cannot be killed." When Alejandro insisted, Navarro would rise out of his seat cursing him and reach to the side of his jacket, showcasing the dagger on his belt. He cursed violently at Alejandro, spilling his ale everywhere, and he even lunged, scaring him off as Alejandro ran outside of the bar. As Alejandro left the bar to head back to his village, he could hear the sailors of that group roaring in laughter as they made fun of him after he left the tavern. Alejandro was completely humiliated, but he remembered his mission, so the next day he went back to the tavern and found Narvaez there with his men again drinking heavily. He went up to Narvaez and gave the exact same pitch as before, this time telling him, "You will take me as first mate on your ship, and you will take me to Toro." But again, Narvaez would balk at him and run him out of the tavern, humiliate him completely again. But Alejandro would keep coming back to the tavern and keep persisting. And the more that Narvaez drank and the more that Alejandro persisted, the more he began to respect just how persistent he was. Eventually, Narvaez agreed to finally let him on the ship. But Alejandro was new and he didn't have any experience, so Narvaez wanted him to prove himself. When they finally set sail into the Atlantic on their new whaling voyage, every single day Narvaez would ride him ceaselessly. He would give him task after meaningless task, just humiliating him and making him do all kinds of things that weren't even needed. He wanted to break Alejandro's spirits, but Alejandro was on a mission. So every single day when he was sitting there scrubbing that wooden deck, he would just go into a different place and daydream about what it would be like when he would finally hook Toro Monstruo, gain his revenge, and the entire town would raise him up in the arms and he would be the hero. Over the weeks, Alejandro would learn to fall in love with sailing beyond just his mission. And he loved the feeling of the raw wood rubbing against his feet as he would sprint up and down the deck, as well as the sun on his face and the smell of the salt ocean seawater. One day, Alejandro was sitting there waiting for his shift, eating one of his provisions, a stale piece of bread, when he heard the sound, "Whale! Whale!" So a bit of context of how whaling actually works. When they hunt the whale, they're actually looking for the blubber to turn the blubber into oil. One of the main strategies for killing these whales is to take the mothership that the men are traveling on and corral the whales in a certain direction by chasing them. And then they take smaller ships and circle around in front of the whales to catch them as they're leading by. Then they'll take a large harpoon and hook the whales in the back by throwing this harpoon or spear into their backs, and a long rope tied to the harpoon they'll wrap around a cleat bolted onto the small boat. Then as the whale is trying to swim away, he'll actually be dragging the boat alongside. Now eventually this giant weight, the boat that he's dragging, will tire him out, and he'll eventually just start floating there and he can't swim any farther, and that's when they will take spears or harpoons and kill him there. Captain Navarez would spin the wheel, turning the rudder in the direction of the whales. That's when all of the excitement on the boat just kicked up a notch as all the men scattered to their stations and they started to wheel down all the extra sails to start to pick up speed in pursuit of this whale pod. They were following the whales for about an hour and the seas just got rougher and rougher as the boat would cut through the ocean, hit a wave, and the bow would rise up and then slap down into the ocean, spraying water as it cut over the sides of the boat and sprayed ocean water over the top, hitting the men in the face. Eventually they would get the positioning that they wanted on this whale pod, and they would slow down and lower the smaller boats into the ocean that was packed with paddles, harpoons, and rope. Alejandro's heart was beating out of his chest as he would crawl down the rope ladder and get into this small boat. These smaller boats were filled with only the best sailors that were the best at killing whales. So Alejandro made sure that he was on the boat with Captain Navarez. As soon as these smaller boats hit the water, Alejandro grabbed the paddles and began to row as fast as he could off of the side of the boat, as these smaller ships would veer off trying to flank the whales. So the lead ship would corral the whales back around and these smaller ships would be there waiting for them. Alejandro was petrified with fear, but he wasn't trying to show it. But Captain Navarez noticed it immediately. He said to him, "Now we'll see if you're as hard as your mouth be saying, boy." The men on these smaller boats were dead quiet because they didn't want to give away their position. So all you could hear was the waves slapping against the side of the boat. And off in the distance, you could see the pod of whales starting to come directly towards them, slowly and very far out as they inched closer and closer and closer. And eventually you could actually hear the blowholes of the whales shooting ocean seawater up into the sky. As these whales are passing along the side of the boat, you get a glimpse of just how big these whales are in comparison to this small boat that they were on, and just how dangerous of a situation this actually was for the men. So all of a sudden, Captain Navarez yells, "Yah, yah, yah!" And all the men erupted out of their silence and began to scream very loudly, trying to scare the whales as they gave pursuit. Now, in this giant commotion, Alejandro lost his composure and he forgot his training that he had been training on. He immediately grabbed one of the wooden harpoons and stood up and raised, about to harpoon one of these whales that was closest to the boat. Just as he did this, Captain Navarez shouted at him, "No, boy," and he slapped him across the face, sending Alejandro back into the side of the boat. Alejandro was seeing stars, but as his vision came out of that blurriness, Out along the distant horizon, he could see what looked to be a spear or a stick sticking out of the water, and he immediately knew that was Toro, and he screamed violently, "Toro, Toro, Toro!" And all the men shifted their attention and looked over in the direction that he was pointing, and they all grew violently excited as they recognized this was the legendary Toro monstruo whale that everybody wanted to kill. So they spin the boat in the direction of Toro, and Captain Navarez rips the harpoon out of Alejandro's hands and raises it up because he is going to be the one to hook Toro. And as they get closer and closer to Toro, you can see the stick coming out of the water, the broken harpoon, and they all knew this was the famous whale. Captain Navarez raises the harpoon and launches it with incredible accuracy, jabbing it straight into the back of Toro Monstruo, sticking it, and the barbs would not allow the harpoon to come out. So as the whale starts to dive and go forward, it torques on the back of the rope, which comes back to the cleat that's mounted on the boat. As the whale pulls the boat, it torques on the rope and all the pressure goes onto the cleat. The men erupt with cheers because they're so excited that they hooked Toro, and they knew that when they kill this whale, they're all going to be legends in the town. But Toro was no ordinary whale. He was massive. And that's why he was so legendary, because of his size and the danger that he imposed. So as he's diving and swimming along, he's yanking at the boat, just dragging this pretty large sized boat through the water. But they knew that eventually, no matter how big the whale was, he couldn't drag them down, and he would eventually get tired. And when he got tired, he would just be floating there, and he would be a sitting duck for them to get him with a whole bunch of harpoons. So Alejandro watches in amazement with his heart beating out of his chest at this giant sea beast pulling them. After about 10 to 15 minutes, the whale starts to slow down, and they're thinking this is going to be their moment when they finally get him. But when they finally slow down, they notice that the other harpooning boat that was not attached to Toro was actually right there next to him. Toro had actually taken him in a giant circle and circled back towards the other boats. Now, Toro was sitting still in the water. They couldn't quite see him underneath the water because the rope was too long and the sea was too black. All the men on both of these boats are sitting there staring at this black sea because they know he's right there. They just can't see him. So Alejandro grabs the rope, attached the harpoon, and slowly starts to pull it. But he finds that the rope is completely taut. Gives it a couple tugs, trying to almost tug at this whale, trying to bring him to the surface or scare him or get him to do something. And all the men are standing there staring at this black water with their harpoons ready. All of a sudden, the black water starts to bulge up, and then it eventually breaks and cracks open and turns white as this whale comes rushing directly vertical out of the water 10, 20, 30 feet into the air, twisting and then falling directly back down onto the other boat, cracking it and splitting it completely in half. Some of the men are knocked unconscious while the others are completely screaming as they fall into this black water and start to paddle violently for their lives. Toro falls into the water with such incredible force. Eventually, he torques on the rope as he falls into the water, and it pulls on the other boat that's attached to him, rocking it violently to one side before popping the bolts and the cleats completely out of the wooden boat, flipping it to the other side and capsizing the boat from the rushing black water that fills the boat up as it slowly begins to sink. Nobody knows what truly happened after that, because the only person to survive was Alejandro himself when he was picked up by the larger ship that was corralling the whales. And all the other men that had fallen into the water had perished in the sea. As far as how Alejandro tells the tale, the rope attached to the cleat, attached to the harpoon on the whale, had wrapped around Captain Navarez's leg and dragged him underwater. The last thing Alejandro saw was Captain Navarez sinking into the water as he reached for the surface and slowly disappeared into the black abyss. Alejandro would never sail again and never go hunting for any type of whale, and would give up his revenge for Toro Monstruo for good. But the legend of Toro Monstruo would actually grow. If you enjoyed this legendary tale of Toro Monstruo, I want you to leave a comment in the comments section. Do you think these whalers got what they deserved for hunting such a majestic creature? I want you to know that I very much appreciate all of the subscribers, likes, and comments. Peace.